Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm Sam, and this is How Do Things Good. Today we're going to talk about the Super Nintendo, how the console is aging and may someday cease to exist, why this is a bad thing for art, and how even a relative electronics low-tier plebeian like myself can do something to stop this from happening. The Super Nintendo, or SNES as it's often affectionately known, is a 16-bit games console, which in the simplest language possible means that it can transfer 16 pieces of data at any one time through its central processing unit, or CPU. Make much sense to you? No, me neither really. I'm looking to go into something a little bit different, particularly why the SNES is worth preserving. What's important to me are the memories that this charming grey box provided as I was growing up, and the idea that there might come a time when revisiting those outside of emulation might become an impossibility. That, as a result, these artworks might in some way be lost as the canvas decays. More on that later. Dinky electronic tunes laid over superb pixel art graphics finally honed platformers like Super Mario World and intricate worlds for exploration like Super Metroid. There are so many factors that led to the SNES and other consoles like it being a key part of so many modern gamers' early memories. The elegant design of these earlier 16-bit cartridge games, made to fit on storage mediums, mere megabytes in space at their best, has enjoyed a bit of a renaissance recently with a fresh resurgence of the Metroidvania in games like Hollow Knight and Dead Cells, and a glut of more traditional pixel art platformers like Shovel Knight. I'm realising that a lot of these throwback games are about knights, enjoying renewed critical attention and acclaim. Those old solutions designed to work around the lower capabilities of these consoles have become stylistic decisions for game genres even today. To avoid putting too fine a point on it, however, the Super Nintendo is, as a console, dying, but it can be saved. So why does the Super Nintendo need saving? You might have paused the video to go and grab your own SNES from its dusty box at the back of the garage and plugged it in to find everything functioning more or less as you remember it. But there's a hidden enemy here, gnawing away at the vital components. Many categories of antiques and other vintage items end up stored away for many years and are often still reasonably functional when they're dug back out. Although the Rosetta Stone is in two pieces, it never really had that many complicated parts in the first case. Not long ago, scientists even managed to piece together a working model of the Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek hand-powered moving map of the solar system, which had sat at the bottom of the sea rusting for over 2,000 years. While this process was infamously a major pain in the neck for the archaeologists due to the intricate system of gears, all of the parts were physical, moving components, unlike the delicate digital architectures of 20th century tech. Super Nintendos and many other computers and games consoles like it are not nearly as robust when stored away in a box in the loft or the garage. Even if kept at a reasonably stable and dry atmosphere, there is one part of them in particular that can and does completely destroy the circuit boards: capacitors. Electrolytic capacitors specifically, and more often the surface-mounted variety as found in the SNES than the through-hole type, but both are infamous for leaking their contents onto the board. Relatively recently, I have purchased several Super Nintendos in a row from eBay at a cheap price, with the intention of giving them a bit of a refurbishment and future-proofing them before selling them on. But I continually see that two capacitors in particular, C59 and C60, frequently have the early signs of leakage on the pads underneath them. Capacitors act a bit like tiny rechargeable batteries on the board. They store electrons from the electrical current around a circuit and then release them at a steady, predetermined rate depending on their capacitance. This means you can keep a steady voltage supplied to a component that might fry if you just hooked it up straight to the mains electricity. If you're interested in the ins and outs, I've linked an excellent article in How Stuff Works in the Down There part, along with all of my other sources. Yeah, I'm one of those people. For our purposes, all you need to know is that, like a battery, an electrolytic capacitor contains an electrolyte substance which is strongly corrosive. I mentioned earlier that Super Nintendos use surface-mounted capacitors. These sit in a little pool of solder on top of the circuit board between two metal pads. They're also notorious for leaking. The 8-bit guy, who I really recommend you go and check out if old computers and games consoles are your thing, made an estimate that in about 10 years, any Macintosh 2 computer, built in 1987, and which also makes use of surface-mount capacitors, which hasn't been recapped, will be totally non-functional due to the corrosion caused when the electrolyte leaks over the other components. The SNES, by and large, is still in a golden window of opportunity. Most Super Nintendos I have looked into have been largely unaffected, with the exception of the capacitors at positions C59 and C60. Paradoxically, in virtually every unit I have opened, these capacitors have leaked and started to corrode the board. It's often not even noticeable until you lift the capacitor and realise that it's lifted the metal pad right along with it. Luckily, this is an easy fix and doesn't require a host of expensive equipment beyond a few soldering tools. Additionally, we can replace the surface-mounted capacitors with the more reliable through-hole versions, with a small modification to the new capacitor's legs. It's not that difficult, and even novices with the soldering iron will be able to pick up the technique, although you might want to practice on something else first. You will obviously also need a set of capacitors. Now, if you're based in the UK, I can actually highly recommend ordering them from RS Components, who will pretty much get them to you the next working day if they have them in stock. You can find out which capacitors you need by checking the model ID, which will be printed on your Super Nintendo circuit board, and checking it against the Console 5 Tech Wiki online. That's just the website I use. Other websites are available, of course. It is vitally important that you get the right capacitance. This is the number followed by the U and the weird F symbol, measured in microfarads. Exact voltage is not as important, providing that your capacitor is rated above the value of the one you are replacing, and of course providing that it fits into the spot that you are putting it into. Right, so we're going to show you how to recap a SNES. You're going to start off, you're going to have to get the SNES open. To do this, you're going to need a security screwdriver bit. They're pretty easy to get hold of. You can get them for a couple of quid on Amazon. I certainly did, and mine seems to work perfectly fine. Also works on Game Boys. You tend to get them in a set of two, a big one and a little one. You're going to need the big one for this job. So you just take out the screws from the bottom like so. There we go. Obviously I've sped up some bits of this because you don't want to see me faffing around for ages with a bunch of screws, and then you just lift it open. I decided to change the camera angle for this point. Boom, there we go. So we are now inside the SNES. You're going to want to remove the controller port gently now. That is a ribbon cable, so just shuffle it from side to side. The ejector is pretty easy to remove as well. Just remember to get the spring and pop all of that somewhere safe for putting back in later. Give the power switch a bit of a toggle before you actually unscrew any of this stuff. It means the capacitors will have fully discharged after you have used the unit before. And you unplug it from the power. Just remove all the screws that you can see at this point. I tend to start with the RF shield as so, and then go for the cartridge port. You'll notice that the screws on the cartridge port are actually slightly longer than the screws that are holding the rest of the PCB in. But yeah, just keep removing screws until you've got all of them out. Keep a mental note of which one, of where the long screws go and where the short screws go, but it's generally pretty easy. You'll work it out. Once you've done that, you can lift the PCB out of the plastic unit like so. Okay, so what you're going to want to do now is you're going to want to remove the screws that are holding that metal shield on the top, but careful now, remember to remove the screw in the transistor first like this, otherwise you're going to cause yourself some problems further down the line. So you just pop that one out. Then there's three screws. There's this one here, and this one here, and the top should come more or less straight off with a bit of a wiggle. Be careful of that transistor as you are pulling it off. Now, the first capacitor that we're going to remove on this is this big one here. It's a 2200 microfarad, I do believe. This is a through-hole capacitor, so these are nice and easy. Just mark out where it's coming through on the bottom of the board with a bit of Sharpie. See there, we've done that. And then what you're going to want to do is that you're going to want to add a little bit of solder onto the bottom of it before you try sucking the solder up with your solder sucker. This is pretty basic stuff for soldering, really. Then you just heat it up, pull out the solder with your solder sucker until the hole is clear, and give it a bit of a wiggle, and it should come loose like so. You may need to apply a bit of heat to it if it doesn't. Anyway, I tend to go over it with a bit of solder wick afterwards. This stuff has Rosine flux built into it, so it cleans the hole at the same time as, it applies the Rosine and it cleans the hole at the same time, gets rid of all the extra solder. Now, this is a list that I got off Console 5 of all of the capacitors that are going to go into this particular unit. You can actually see the unit name, and here is the numbers for each of the capacitors that you're going to be referring to on that list. Anyway, this is the technique for removing those surface-mounted capacitors. You're going to want to add a little bit of solder on either side, gently now with this. There's some bits of plastic there, and there's obviously all kinds of IC chips all over the board. But yeah, just gently add a little bit of solder onto either side. This makes the next step a little bit easier. Then you're going to want to get your tweezers and your soldering iron and just gently heat up either side and give it a bit of a waggle, a gentle waggle each way. Eventually you'll start to feel it give way. Don't tug on it, you don't really want to be pulling those pads up. That is an absolute nightmare of a thing to fix. Trust me, it's bodge wires and everything from that routine. But just give it a gentle waggle until eventually the capacitor will come loose. And then you get your solder wick out. And just clean up the rest of those bits of solder on the pad. Give the pad a bit of a clean. If your wick doesn't have Rosin flux on it, this would be a good time to add your own. You can get it in little pens. I've got a Rosin flux pen kicking around somewhere, but I must admit I'm kind of lazy. I prefer using the stuff that is just on the solder wick, like so. Using solder wick, nice and easy. Just apply heat to the top of the wick on top of the pad using your soldering iron. Give it a little bit of a scrub, and that tends to work really well. Okay, so what you're going to want to do now is you're going to want to add a little bit of solder back onto the pad. This is going to help with actually getting the capacitor to stick in place. You only want a little bit, just enough to be able to stick it in place. Then, because we're using through-hole capacitors as opposed to SMDs, you're actually going to want to bend the legs down a bit. Obviously, work out which side is negative and which side is positive before you start. Remember that on a surface mount capacitor, the flat side is the negative side, and on these through-hole ones they usually mark the negative with a bit of a line. But yeah, you make a little bit of a saddle shape like that. I find it tends to help if you take a bit of, I believe it's called caftan tape or something along those lines. It's heat-resistant tape, effectively. If you use that to basically hold it in place while you're soldering, you will find this a much easier task. You can't really solder with one hand and tweezer with the other. I've tried, it is not a simple thing to do. But just get those lined up over the pads, and then get your soldering iron out and your tweezers. Just apply gentle pressure on the tweezers downwards so it holds it in place, and just melt the solder and just melt it onto the pad there. Make sure that the soldering iron is touching the solder, the pad, and the leg of the capacitor. You may want to add a little bit more solder on the top at this point. I always do, like so. And hey presto, there you go. Capacitor attached. Through-hole capacitor, which are much more reliable, attached where the surface mount capacitor used to be. Easy enough. So then you're going to want to remove the tape. And ordinarily what you'd do at this point is that you would actually, you'd clip the legs on the capacitors, you give them a little bit of a flick up and get your wire clippers out, give them a bit of a trim so they're not getting everywhere, not going to interfere with anything. And then I would ordinarily point the capacitors back upwards into a vertical position, as you're going to see me do here. But I'm going to show you why this isn't a good idea for this specific capacitor. It's because this is where the RF shield goes, and the RF shield is quite low on this, so if you have it pointing upwards, it's not going to fit. So don't be afraid to just bend it back down and sort of wiggle it into a place where you're comfortable with it being. Make sure it's not making contact anything else on the board, otherwise it just won't work. Anyway, for the rest of the capacitors on this, we're going to speed through them because it's pretty much the same process. So anyway, I'm going to put on some nice music, and here we go. Okay, so I've brought the music down for a bit here, and the speed as well, because this is where we're going to get stuck into capacitors C59 and C60. These are perpetually causing me problems on these boards. These are the ones that I talked about earlier. They always seem to have a little bit of corrosion underneath them. I don't know what it is really. All of the rest of the capacitors on Super Nintendos seem to be generally alright, but these two, there's always a little bit of something that seems to leak out of them. I really don't know why they do it. Anyway, the process is very much the same. As you can see, a little bit of solder on either side. Then we're going to give them a little bit of wiggle with the tweezers. Be very careful when doing this. Like most of the Super Nintendos have had the pads lift a little bit on these two capacitors, and it's been an absolute nightmare. This one did actually behave itself, which I was extremely thankful for. Anyway, in a second we're actually going to give you a close-up shot of the damage that these capacitors have done to this particular board. It's not extensive, and it's certainly not as extensive as I have seen it in the past. Don't worry about that yellow, that's just a bit of rosin flux. But you can see there's a little bit of corrosion around some of those traces, which is certainly not a good thing. Now that's definitely something that we can fix though, or at least that we can remedy, I suppose. If you've got a little bit of white vinegar, I found that rice vinegar works really well for this, but for this purposes I had some white malt vinegar kicking around. Put a little bit of that on a cotton bud, give it a little bit of a rub in the area, give it a bit of a clean, and that's actually going to neutralise the alkali from the capacitors. Then give it a bit of a rub with IPA and you're ready to go. Give it a bit of a blow to dry it off, and yeah, then you can apply the capacitors as per the normal routine. See how much better does that look? It may not have actually like prettied up the area, but you can guarantee that that corrosion is going to have been stopped in its tracks. So yeah, putting the SNES back together is pretty much taking it apart, but in reverse, just putting the screws in the opposite order to the way that you put them in. You may have noticed quickly as well that I added a little bit of thermal paste onto the transistor. I just tend to do this. Makes me feel happier, really. It's not really necessary, but yeah, anyway, after you've recapped it, give it a test, make sure it all still works. As you can see, this one booted up just fine with all of its fresh capacitors. But yeah, anyway, I hope you enjoyed. That is how you recap a SNES with through-hole capacitors. The Super Nintendo is a valuable piece of gaming history, and although there are a huge number of them floating around for cheap at the moment, this will not always be the case. For this last part of the video, I'd like to change tack slightly and talk about the SNES outside of its presence in history and nostalgic memories. Instead, I'd like to make my final case for preserving the Super Nintendo by talking about it as it is, a canvas on which art is portrayed, a canvas which is starting to deteriorate as the days go by, which should be preserved because it is a medium for art. Now, let me explain what I mean. Despite what the late film critic Roger Ebert and his ilk say, video games are art. While not as old as writing or music, they are creative endeavours born of human labour that can project an emotive response onto the person who experiences them. Rather than cobbling together and relying on my own definition of art, a concept that is notoriously difficult to nail down, I present to you a definition of art as put forward by Leslie Elizabeth Kreiner, a Florida State University graduate who published an essay in the journal Art Education, which attempted to come towards a universally applicable definition of art. Art is the human activity in which one, through the conscious use of skill and imagination, represents a particular action or experience with the intention of illuminating the universal quality of that action, producing delight through instruction. We might even quibble over the term delight through instruction, being as we live in such a world where tangible senses of horror and tragedy are present in paintings such as the attempt of blowing up the chain bridge by Ernie von Hutenbrenner, as well as the growing sense of gnawing existential terror in video games like Spec Ops: The Line. This is, however, as good and concise a definition as any other I've found. Video games are art because they are the conscious creations of a group of devoted artists who wish to convey a set of actions and the emotive responses that go with them.
In old horror movies, they always use silver to kill the monster. Stakes, crosses, bullets, didn't matter. So long as it was silver. In Dubai, these hostiles are using silver bullets to kill soldiers. Guess that makes us monsters.
To give an example of this on the Super Nintendo then, 1994's Super Metroid has been carefully crafted to present the idea that you are travelling into an unknown, dangerous and often frightening underground labyrinth. For a two-dimensional side-scrolling platformer, it has this phenomenal ability to immerse the player into its world and to feel closely tied to the small pixelated protagonist as she navigates it. The long distances between each of the save points makes you feel tension in a way that's probably very familiar to anyone who has ever played a more modern Souls-like, with venturing forth feeling both like a risk and a necessity for survival the further you get from your last base camp. The music can vary between triumphant and downright unsettling. In the wrecked ship, the ambient near silence is deafening, and the Super Metroid boss theme becomes a Pavlovian trigger for a very specific kind of panic, particularly if you're running low on health and you've accidentally wandered into the Crocamire's lair. The feeling of dread as you descend further into the underbelly of Zebes is at times unbearable. There's a great essay on this that I really recommend checking out over on Video Game Animation Study, which I will include a link to as well. But Super Metroid also encapsulates other positive elements to exploration. The simple joy in finding the route you've been looking for hidden cleverly in a wall you'd passed before, and the intellectual buzz from figuring out a puzzle and executing the acrobatics required just right to make it through. Just as attempt of blowing up the chain bridge is painted onto a physical canvas, so too do video games like Super Metroid have a medium, the hardware that supports them. A great amount of resource is put into preserving old works of art as the canvas that supports them starts to fray and give way and the paint begins to fleck, so that future generations might understand and know the artist's original intention. It would be a bit of an insult to suggest that a digital scan of a painting would be anything even remotely close to being subjected to it in person. Every ridge and dip in the paint, every tiny detail, even the smell of aging paint, it all contributes to the experience. It is entirely possible, and indeed has been done many a time, to port a video game's code and run it in a simulated version of the original console. However, like the digital scan, it loses much in translation. Say what you like about the video rendering abilities of the old Super Nintendo, there's something just essentially and intangibly right about playing a SNES game on a SNES, compared with the pixel-perfect sharpness and precision of an emulator. Something in the art is lost when the canvas changes, and when it's so easy to preserve the canvas, the question arises, in the name of art, why wouldn't you? Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please drop us a like and tap on that subscribe button to see more in future. I'm hoping to be uploading regular videos all about maintaining the things that we love and the joys of creation. Feel free to drop your thoughts and ideas into the comments section so that I can mercilessly plunder them for future content. Bye now.